Daniel Whitmore walked into his anniversary dinner, confident and in control, unaware that his entire world was about to crumble. His mistress had planned a dramatic entrance, but his wife had planned something far worse. By dessert, she would toast to her freedom, and he would realize he had lost everything. The city shimmered under the glow of golden streetlights as Daniel Whitmore adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. His reflection in the tinted glass of the car door was exactly what he expected: controlled, powerful, untouchable. He exhaled slowly before stepping onto the curb, where a valet immediately rushed forward. The man barely met Daniel's gaze as he handed over the keys, murmuring a polite, "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel barely acknowledged him, already turning to extend his hand toward his wife, Cassandra Whitmore, as she stepped out of the car with the practiced grace of someone who belonged in this world. Her emerald green dress clung elegantly to her figure. Her dark hair swept into a sleek updo that exposed the sharp curve of her jawline, a vision of sophistication. And yet, something about her silence tonight felt different. Too measured, too restrained. Daniel wrapped an arm around her waist as they made their way inside La Riviere, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The moment they entered, the familiar scent of aged wine and truffle oil filled the air. He had chosen this place carefully. The dim lighting, the delicate hum of hushed conversations, the impeccable service. Everything designed to create the illusion of intimacy. It was their 10th anniversary. After all, the evening had to be perfect. A maitre d' appeared instantly, all warm smiles and reverence. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, your table is ready. Right this way." Cassandra offered a polite nod but said nothing. Daniel guided her through the restaurant, past patrons who stole fleeting glances in their direction, some admiring, others envious. It was always like this. They were a spectacle, a power couple, the kind people whispered about but never dared approach. As they settled into their private booth, Daniel loosened his tie slightly, reaching for the wine list. "Something special tonight," he mused, scanning the menu. "Shall we go with the 2002 Bordeaux? It's been waiting for the right occasion." Cassandra didn't immediately respond. Instead, she ran her fingers along the rim of her glass, her nails tapping ever so slightly against the crystal. "Sure," she finally said, her voice smooth, unreadable. Daniel studied her for a moment before motioning for the sommelier. The bottle was presented with ceremony, uncorked, poured into delicate glasses. The deep red liquid swirled, rich with history. Daniel lifted his glass, offering his wife a charming, knowing smile. "To us," he said. Cassandra clinked her glass against his, but didn't drink right away. She studied him over the rim, eyes unreadable. Daniel took a sip, savoring the warmth, the boldness of the wine. He set his glass down, resting his forearms on the table. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked, tilting his head slightly. Cassandra finally took a sip of her wine, then placed the glass down with a deliberate softness. "Am I?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You are. I expected a bit more enthusiasm, given the occasion." She held his gaze for a moment before offering a small, enigmatic smile. "I suppose I'm just reflecting." "On what?" Another pause. Another slow sip of wine. "Oh, 10 years. Everything we've built." She traced the stem of her glass with her fingers, her voice light. "Everything we've hidden." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, but he forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Darling, you always did love being dramatic." Cassandra's lips curved slightly, though not in amusement. "Do I?" For the first time that evening, Daniel felt slightly off balance. It was subtle, the way she was looking at him, the way her words seemed carefully measured rather than offhand. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the energy of the room. Yet now, Cassandra's silence, her perfectly poised demeanor, was unsettling him. The appetizers arrived, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops over saffron risotto. The presentation was flawless, but Daniel found his appetite suddenly lacking. Cassandra picked up her fork, slicing through the scallop with precision. "Do you remember our first anniversary?" Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown off by the shift in conversation. He recovered quickly, offering a nostalgic smile. Of course, Paris. The hotel balcony. The ridiculous amount of champagne. Cassandra nodded slowly. That was a good night. She took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. Back then, everything felt real. Daniel's fingers curled slightly against the table. And it doesn't now? Cassandra met his gaze with a soft, unreadable smile. What do you think? He exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders back. I think you're in a strange mood tonight. She hummed softly, as if considering his words. Maybe I am. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Is something bothering you? Cassandra tilted her head, studying him. Would it matter if it was? Daniel didn't like where this was going. He could feel himself losing ground, and that was something he never allowed. He reached for her hand across the table, squeezing gently. Cass, whatever it is, we can talk about it. She let him hold her hand for a moment before withdrawing, reaching instead for her wine glass. Can we? The sommelier returned to check on them, refilling their glasses. The moment stretched unbearably, and Daniel forced himself to relax. This was nothing, just a strange mood. Cassandra was always sharp, always observant, but she didn't know anything. He had been careful. He always was. The waiter approached with the main course, breaking the tension. Medium-rare filet mignon, perfectly plated. Daniel picked up his knife, cutting into the tender meat. Let's enjoy our night, he said, his voice effortlessly smooth again. No cryptic remarks. No strange moods. Cassandra took another sip of wine, setting her glass down carefully. She lifted her fork, but didn't immediately eat. Of course, she murmured. But as Daniel chewed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him had shifted just slightly. That for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't the one controlling the game. If you were in Cassandra's shoes, would you have done the same? Or taken an even more ruthless approach? Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done in her place. And while you're here, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. Daniel Whitmore leaned back against the plush leather of the booth, swirling the deep red wine in his glass as if the motion itself could settle the growing unease in his chest. Cassandra sat across from him, poised and elegant, but there was something unreadable in her expression, something distant. It was unusual, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel found himself trying to interpret her instead of the other way around. He was used to being the one with the upper hand in every conversation, the one who set the tone and dictated the mood, but tonight was different. She had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, her words careful, her gaze slow and deliberate, like she was measuring the weight of everything he said. The conversation had felt like a chess game. Every move he made countered with an almost invisible strategy of her own, and that unsettled him in a way he didn't want to admit. The tension in the air was subtle but undeniable, a slow tightening coil that had been winding since the moment they arrived. The dim lighting of La Riviere only enhanced the feeling of being observed, the hushed whispers of other patrons blending into the soft hum of the restaurant. Daniel took another sip of his wine and exhaled, deciding that whatever was going on with Cassandra, he would smooth it over by the end of the night. He always did. He always won. And then, just as he placed his glass back onto the table, a voice sliced through the ambient noise of the restaurant, sharp and sweet, dripping with a confidence that sent ice through his veins. Happy anniversary, darling. Daniel's body stiffened mid-motion. That voice, it was impossible. His fingers froze around the stem of his glass as he slowly turned his head. A pair of familiar, sharp eyes met his, eyes filled with mocking amusement, with the kind of arrogant certainty that made his blood run cold. Melanie Carter, his mistress, dressed in a striking, scarlet-red silk dress, she stood just a few feet away from their table, her hands resting elegantly on her hips, her lips curved in a knowing smirk. She looked every bit the woman she was, young, bold, and dangerously confident. Daniel's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. No, 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 no. She wasn't supposed to be here. Cassandra, still seated, didn't move, didn't even flinch. Instead, she simply turned her head ever so slightly, taking in the scene with eerie composure. Her green eyes flickered toward Melanie, then back to Daniel, and for a single, devastating moment, He felt like the prey in a trap he didn't even know had been set. Melanie let out a small, amused laugh, clearly reveling in the attention. "Oh, don't stop on my account. I was just passing by and thought it would be rude not to say hello." Daniel forced himself to breathe, forcing his expression into something neutral, something dismissive. "Melanie," he said smoothly, his voice betraying none of the internal chaos flooding his veins. "What a surprise." She tilted her head, her hair cascading over one shoulder as she gave him a look that burned with concealed delight. "Is it?" Daniel clenched his jaw just slightly, enough that only someone who knew him well would notice. Cassandra would notice. Cassandra, who had yet to say a single word. She simply watched, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass, the corners of her mouth twitching just barely, as if something about this moment was expected. Daniel felt the world around him shift. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Melanie slid into the booth beside him, her perfume heavy with jasmine and something sharper, something intoxicating. She rested a hand on his forearm like she belonged there, her nails grazing over the expensive fabric of his suit sleeve. "I was wondering when you were going to tell your wife about us," she mused, voice laced with mock sympathy. "Or were you planning to keep me a secret forever?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the table's edge beneath the crisp linen cloth. His entire mind was a raging storm, calculating escape routes, planning damage control, anything to defuse the explosion he knew was about to happen. His eyes flickered toward Cassandra again. She was still composed, but something in her expression made his stomach drop. There was no shock, no disbelief, no anger, only curiosity, like she was watching something she had already predicted. Daniel felt the first sharp pang of true fear. Cassandra reached for her wine glass, took a slow sip, then finally spoke. "Well," she said, her voice as smooth as the wine in her hand, "this is certainly unexpected." Melanie smirked. "Is it?" Cassandra placed her glass back onto the table, her fingers resting lightly against the stem. "Oh, I don't know," she murmured. "It almost feels inevitable." Daniel stopped breathing. What the hell was happening? Melanie hesitated, her confidence flickering just slightly, like a flame encountering the first whisper of wind. Daniel saw it then, the tiny shift in power. Melanie had come here expecting to destroy Cassandra, to humiliate her, to tear apart the illusion of the perfect wife with a single well-placed dagger. But Cassandra wasn't breaking. She wasn't even reacting. And that was throwing Melanie off. Daniel, caught in the crossfire, had no idea how to regain control. Melanie narrowed her eyes, tilting her head at Cassandra. "You're awfully calm for a woman who just found out her husband has been lying to her." Cassandra smiled. Not a large, performative smile. Not the smile of someone pretending to be fine. No, it was small, knowing, and terribly dangerous. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Cassandra reached forward, casually cutting into her filet mignon, lifting a perfectly portioned bite to her lips. She chewed delicately, swallowed, and then, without breaking eye contact, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin. Finally, she looked at Melanie again and said, softly, almost pityingly, "Oh, darling, I've known." The words landed like a gunshot. Melanie froze. Daniel felt the bottom of his world collapse. Cassandra took another sip of wine, watching them both with cool amusement. "Now," she said, setting her glass down, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying more weight than anything else in the room, "why don't you tell me what you thought was going to happen tonight?" Melanie's mouth opened, then closed, her confidence suddenly dismantled in real time. Daniel's breath felt like it had caught in his throat. He was no longer the one in control, and for the first time in his life, he was starting to realize it. Daniel Whitmore felt the blood drain from his face. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this creeping realization that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. He had walked into this restaurant with confidence, certain of the narrative he controlled. But now, sitting between his wife and his mistress, watching the smirk on Cassandra's lips, he knew he had miscalculated something. Something big. Melanie shifted uncomfortably beside him, the flicker of doubt creeping into her expression. She had expected an explosion, expected tears, a broken woman unraveling before her very eyes. But instead, she was met with this eerie calm, this knowing smirk that didn't belong to someone just discovering betrayal. "I'm sorry, what?" Melanie finally asked, her voice not as sharp as before. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, like she was enjoying a puzzle she had already solved. "I said," she repeated, tapping her nail lightly against the rim of her wine glass, "I've known." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing through every possible way out of this mess. But there was no clear path. The usual excuses wouldn't work. The charm, the damage control, none of it would land the way he needed it to. Melanie let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "No, that doesn't make sense." Cassandra's eyes flicked toward her, then back to Daniel. "Doesn't it?" Daniel hated how much control she still had. Melanie, still trying to regain her footing, crossed her arms, leaning back against the booth. "If you knew, why would you stay?" Cassandra smiled at that, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was something colder, something that made the wine in Daniel's glass feel suddenly unnecessary. "Oh, Melanie," she murmured. "You assume I stayed for him." Daniel's fingers curled slightly against the tablecloth. Cassandra lifted her glass to her lips, taking a slow sip before setting it down carefully. "Tell me," she said, still speaking to Melanie but never breaking eye contact with Daniel. "How exactly did you think this would go?" Melanie blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Excuse me?" Cassandra gestured vaguely toward the space between them. "You clearly had a plan. You didn't just wander in here and stumble upon our table by accident." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to something almost intimate. "What was your move? You thought I'd cry? Cause a scene? Leave in disgrace while you and Daniel enjoyed the rest of the night?" Melanie opened her mouth, then closed it again. Daniel saw the exact moment she realized she had lost control, too. The silence stretched just long enough to feel suffocating. Cassandra exhaled slowly, then turned her attention back to her plate, cutting into her steak as if the conversation had bored her. "It's funny," she mused, voice light but edged with something razor-sharp. "How people always assume they're the smartest one in the room." Daniel gritted his teeth. Enough. He refused to let this night continue spiraling. He leaned in toward Cassandra, keeping his voice low. "We're not doing this here." Cassandra barely acknowledged him. "Oh, darling," she murmured, not looking up from her plate. "We're already doing it." Daniel's pulse throbbed against his temple. He could feel eyes on them now, subtle glances from other diners pretending not to be listening. This wasn't just a private disaster anymore. It was a public spectacle. He turned to Melanie, forcing himself to look in control, even if his insides were unraveling. "You need to leave," he said under his breath, voice firm but quiet enough not to attract more attention. Melanie scoffed, shaking her head. "Are you kidding me?" She gestured toward Cassandra. "She just said she's known this whole time, and you're acting like I'm the problem?" Daniel stared at her, willing her to understand. "Get up. Walk away. Before this gets worse." Melanie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Wow. I knew you were a liar, Daniel, but I didn't think you were actually this pathetic." Cassandra, amused, took another sip of wine. "Oh, I like her," she murmured. Daniel clenched his jaw. Melanie turned back to Cassandra, frustration clear on her face now. "You act like you're in control here, but let's be honest. You're still sitting at this table, aren't you?" Cassandra tilted her head slightly, almost sympathetic. "And yet, you're the one who walked in here hoping for a different outcome." The words landed hard. Melanie's face twisted. For the first time, Daniel saw something crack in her expression, a flicker of embarrassment, of realization. She had walked into this expecting a win, but instead, she had been played. Daniel, desperate to stop this before it escalated further, reached for his wallet, pulling out a black card and sliding it toward Melanie. "Go," he said quietly, "and don't come back." Melanie stared at the card, then up at him. "You think you can just pay me to leave?" Daniel didn't answer. She scoffed, picking up the card and turning it over between her fingers. "You know what's funny?" she said, glancing between him and Cassandra. You two deserve each other. She placed the card back on the table, untouched. And then, without another word, she slid out of the booth and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Daniel let out a slow breath, willing his heartbeat to settle. The restaurant returned to its normal murmur, the silence that had filled the space now easing into something more manageable. A disaster had been avoided. Or at least, that's what he tried to tell himself. Cassandra, however, simply reached for her wine glass again, taking another slow sip before setting it down. Daniel turned to her, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. Are you going to tell me what the hell that was? Cassandra smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Daniel, she murmured, tilting her head. You should be asking yourself that question. Something in her voice sent a chill down his spine. He studied her for a long moment, trying to piece together the puzzle he had clearly missed. But Cassandra had already returned her focus to her dinner, cutting another precise bite of steak as if nothing had happened at all. Daniel felt something shift between them, something subtle but undeniable. This wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel Whitmore's grip on his wine glass was steady, but his pulse was anything but. The confrontation had passed. The moment of public spectacle dissolved back into the usual murmur of the restaurant. Yet the air between him and Cassandra had shifted into something thick, something unspoken but dangerously present. Melanie had left, her sharp words still ringing in his ears, but the real threat, the one he hadn't seen coming, sat across from him, her emerald eyes flickering with something he couldn't read. She had known. How long? How much? How deep did this knowledge go? Cassandra reached for her glass again, sipping slowly, savoring the moment. If he hadn't known any better, he might have thought she was simply enjoying her meal. But he did know better. Cassandra never did anything without purpose. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, trying to regain control of the conversation, of the night, of anything at all. So, he said, keeping his voice smooth, controlled. Are you going to tell me what that was? Cassandra lifted a brow. That? You know exactly what I mean. She set her glass down, tilting her head slightly. Do I? Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing a smile that he knew didn't reach his eyes. Cassandra. Her expression remained unchanged, almost amused. But there was an edge beneath it. Something sharp, something patient. She leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. What exactly would you like me to explain, Daniel? Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against the table. The fact that my mistress just walked in here and tried to humiliate you, and you sat through it like you were watching a particularly boring play. The fact that you weren't surprised. The fact that you said you've known. Cassandra, if you knew, why didn't you say anything? Cassandra inhaled deeply, as if considering his words, then exhaled softly through her nose, her gaze never leaving his. And what would you have done if I had? Daniel paused, thrown by the question. What? She smiled, small and sharp. If I had confronted you the moment I found out, if I had stormed into your office, thrown accusations, demanded answers, what would you have done? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Cassandra nodded slightly, as if that reaction alone was her answer. You would have lied, she said simply. Or worse, you would have made me feel like I was the one losing my mind. You would have given me just enough truth to pacify me, just enough false remorse to make me second-guess my instincts. Isn't that what you do, Daniel? Daniel's jaw clenched. That's not fair, isn't it? Cassandra took another sip of wine, her movements infuriatingly slow, her control over the moment absolute. You see, I didn't confront you because I had no interest in hearing your rehearsed excuses. I wanted facts, not fabrications. She set her glass down and leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. So, I gathered them. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers curled into fists beneath the table, hidden from view, his mind racing through every possible thing she could mean. Gathered them? Cassandra's lips curved. Oh yes. Daniel's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about Melanie. This wasn't just about an affair. She knew something else. Cassandra reached for her fork, cutting another delicate bite of steak before speaking again, her voice light. almost casual. Did you know, Daniel, that when you use an offshore account, you're supposed to be very careful about how you move your money? Daniel went very, very still. His mouth suddenly felt dry. Cassandra lifted her gaze again, eyes locking onto his with that same slow, patient calculation. Of course you know that. You're a businessman. A brilliant one, even. But the thing about brilliance is that it often breeds arrogance. And arrogance, as you know, is how people get caught. Daniel couldn't breathe. His hands were perfectly still on the table, his face carefully blank. But inside, panic surged. She knew, not just about Melanie. She knew about the accounts. Cassandra took another bite of her food, chewed, swallowed. I'm sure you were very careful, she mused. You probably had the right people in place, the right layers of security, the right plausible deniability. She tapped her nail lightly against the rim of her glass. But the problem with secrets, Daniel, is that they only stay hidden if no one is looking for them. And I was looking. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. How? His voice came out lower than he intended. Cassandra's smile was slow, deliberate. Wouldn't you like to know? Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was war. She had been watching him, tracking him. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would be blind, trusting, passive. And that assumption had just become his biggest mistake. Cassandra took another sip of wine, setting the glass down with deliberate care. Don't look so tense, darling, she murmured. I'm not going to ruin dinner with details. Daniel forced himself to smile, to regain some sense of composure. Then what do you want, Cassandra? She held his gaze for a moment, then exhaled softly, tilting her head slightly. To enjoy my meal, she said, and to give you time to think. Daniel's fingers curled so tightly against the edge of the table that his knuckles ached. Think about what? He asked, voice carefully measured. Cassandra's expression darkened just slightly, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. About what comes next, she said simply. Daniel felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest, something dangerously close to fear. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what next meant. And somehow, Cassandra already did. Daniel Whitmore had always believed in control. Control over his business, control over his image, control over the people in his life. It was what had made him a success, what had turned him from an ambitious young man into a name whispered in exclusive circles. He had built an empire on strategy and deception, bending circumstances and people to his will, and it had never failed him. Until now, sitting across from Cassandra in the dim glow of La Riviere, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. It coiled around his ribs, settled in his throat, poisoning the taste of the expensive wine still lingering on his tongue. His wife had just let slip the single most dangerous thing she could have ever said to him. Not only had she known about Melanie, she had been watching him, tracking him, investigating him, and that meant his carefully hidden offshore accounts were no longer a secret. The weight of that realization pressed against his spine, making the air in the restaurant suddenly feel too thick. He wanted to speak, wanted to pull back control of the conversation, but for the first time in his life, he had no idea what move to make next. Cassandra, on the other hand, was perfectly composed, as if they were simply discussing the weather. She picked up her napkin, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a slow, deliberate motion. She was enjoying this. That knowledge sent a sharp wave of something dangerously close to panic through his chest. She had been waiting for this moment. Daniel leaned forward, keeping his voice low. I don't know what you think you've found, but you're making a mistake, Cassandra. She lifted a brow. Am I? His jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're playing with. Her lips curved slightly. Amused. Unshaken. Dangerous. That's what you don't seem to get, darling, she murmured. I understand perfectly. Daniel's stomach tightened. Cassandra took another slow sip of wine, savoring it like she had all the time in the world. Then, without looking at him, she casually reached into her handbag, pulled out a thin, unmarked envelope, and slid it across the table. Daniel stared at it. The silence stretched. The blood in his veins turned to ice. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for it, fingers tightening around the edge as he pulled it toward him. He hesitated for a single breath before opening the flap and pulling out the papers inside. And then his world stopped. It took everything in him not to react. The documents in his hands were a precise, devastatingly accurate paper trail, bank transactions, shell company registrations, offshore deposits, proof of everything he had worked so hard to keep hidden. His entire financial empire, mapped out in cold, indisputable detail. He flicked through the pages, heart hammering against his ribs, his throat dry, his mind screaming at him to find a way out of this. But there was none. This was checkmate. Cassandra watched him, head tilted slightly, studying his reaction like he was some kind of interesting experiment. How? His voice came out tighter than he intended, and he hated that she could probably hear it. Cassandra exhaled softly, shaking her head in mock disappointment. Oh, Daniel, did you really think you were the only one who knew how to play this game? He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe, to think, to regain some semblance of control. You have no idea what you've done. She lifted her wine glass, swirling the liquid inside lazily. I think I do. Daniel's fingers curled into fists around the papers, the weight of them unbearable. What do you want? Cassandra leaned forward slightly, and for the first time that evening, her expression turned serious. Cold. Final. I already took care of it. The words hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. His breath stalled, his vision narrowing, a single, sharp thought slicing through the panic. No. What do you mean? Cassandra gave him a slow, deliberate look, a look that told him it was already too late. I mean, she said, her voice soft but merciless, that by now, those accounts no longer belong to you. Daniel's entire body tensed. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, watching him as if she could see every single thought flicker through his mind. You always did love the illusion of power, she mused. The feeling of being untouchable. But, darling, you forgot something very important. Power isn't about what you own. It's about what you can take away. Daniel's chest ached with the weight of the words. No, this wasn't happening. This wasn't real. His mind worked frantically, desperately searching for a way to reverse this, to fix it, to undo whatever she had done. But as he sat there, staring at the woman he had so severely underestimated, he realized something terrifying. He had lost before he even knew he was playing. Cassandra exhaled softly, pushing her chair back, grabbing her clutch as she stood. I'd love to stay and watch you process this, she said lightly, but I think I'll leave you to enjoy your meal. Daniel's hands tightened around the edge of the table. Cassandra. His voice was low, dangerous. She smiled, small and infuriatingly patient. I'll see you at home, darling. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her movements elegant, effortless, unstoppable. Daniel sat there, the weight of the documents in his hands, the taste of defeat thick on his tongue. And for the first time in his life, he realized something horrifying. He wasn't the predator. He was the prey. Daniel sat motionless in the restaurant, the weight of the documents in his hands heavier than anything he had ever held before. His mind was still racing, trying to process what had just happened. Cassandra had taken everything, not just his dignity in this moment, but his financial empire, the very foundation of his success, the thing that made him who he was. And she had done it without him even noticing. The shock hadn't worn off, but rage was starting to push through it. His fingers curled tightly around the pages as he clenched his jaw. He needed to fix this. He needed to find a way to undo whatever she had done. He refused to believe it was over. It couldn't be. He was Daniel Whitmore, and people like him didn't lose. But she had been planning this for months. He could see it now, looking at the precision of the documents, the way the evidence was laid out so perfectly, so undeniably. Cassandra had been watching him, studying him, moving against him while he had been too busy indulging in the illusion of his own power. The sound of a glass being set down brought him back to the present. His head snapped up, and he realized that Melanie was still there, seated at the edge of the table, watching him carefully. Unlike Cassandra, who had walked away in total control, Melanie looked rattled. Well, she said, breaking the silence. That didn't go the way I thought it would. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to snap at her, wanted to blame her for showing up uninvited, for accelerating the inevitable, but he knew deep down that this wasn't her fault. This wasn't about her at all. Cassandra had already been ahead of him. She had already won before Melanie ever stepped into the restaurant. Melanie leaned forward, lowering her voice as she searched his expression. What the hell just happened, Daniel? Daniel let out a slow breath, trying to suppress the frustration threatening to spill over. You just witnessed my wife destroy me, he said, his voice lower, more controlled now, though barely. Melanie's brows furrowed as she stole a glance at the papers he still held in his grip. I don't understand. What is all that? Daniel let out a hollow laugh, one that had no amusement in it whatsoever. It's everything. Melanie's expression darkened. She had wanted Cassandra to fall apart tonight. She had wanted to break her, to expose her as weak, fragile, replaceable. But instead, she had just watched Cassandra walk away with everything intact. And she hated it. Melanie shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming anxiously against the table. She played you, Daniel. Daniel lifted his gaze to hers, his expression unreadable. You think I don't know that? Melanie swallowed hard, leaning in. What are you going to do? Daniel hesitated for a beat too long. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he was facing an opponent he hadn't prepared for. He had always assumed Cassandra was comfortable, content, uninterested in playing the game he played. He had never considered that she might be playing an entirely different one. Melanie narrowed her eyes. You don't have a plan, do you? Daniel exhaled sharply, hating the vulnerability in that realization. Melanie's lips pressed into a thin line. Then she shook her head, laughing bitterly. Unbelievable. I should have known she wasn't stupid. Daniel stiffened. What? Melanie let out a small scoff, sitting back in her seat. You think I didn't have my doubts about this? You think I didn't wonder if your wife was as clueless as you thought she was? She crossed her arms, her nails digging into her own skin. But no. You kept saying she wouldn't suspect a thing, that she was too busy playing the perfect wife. And I actually believed you. Daniel clenched his jaw. She was playing the perfect wife. Melanie gave him a hard look. No, she was playing you. Daniel's fingers twitched against the paper in his hands, his grip tightening, his frustration turning into something sharper, more dangerous. Melanie exhaled, shaking her head again, her expression unreadable. God, she really turned this whole thing around on you. Daniel's nostrils flared as he tried to grasp onto anything that could salvage this situation, but the reality was sinking in faster than he could push it away. Cassandra hadn't just taken his money. She had taken his power. She had dismantled him in front of the very people he once commanded respect from. And now Melanie saw him as weak too. She was still watching him, waiting for him to react, for him to pull out some last-minute trick that would flip the script again. But there wasn't one. Melanie sighed, running a hand through her hair, her frustration evident. So, what? That's it? You're just going to sit here and let her walk away with everything? Daniel's jaw locked. No, he wasn't. But he needed time. He needed to think. He needed to figure out where he had gone wrong and how to turn this around. Melanie scoffed, shaking her head. You know, I actually thought this was going to be the start of something bigger. Daniel frowned, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Melanie exhaled, looking away for a moment before turning back to him. I wasn't just going to be your little secret forever, Daniel. I thought once you got rid of her, we could actually be something real. Daniel's stomach turned. He had never promised her that. Melanie let out a bitter laugh. But now I see what this really was. I was just a distraction for you. A way to keep yourself entertained while she was setting you up for the fall. She shook her head, staring at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. You're not as smart as you think you are. Daniel's fingers twitched, his entire body tense with the weight of the moment. Melanie stood abruptly, adjusting her dress. Good luck fixing this, she said, her voice sharp, because something tells me Cassandra didn't just walk away tonight. She's already 5 steps ahead of you. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Daniel sitting alone at the table, his entire world collapsing around him. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Cassandra had humiliated him tonight. She had played him better than anyone had ever dared to before. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because if there was one thing Daniel Whitmore knew how to do, it was fight his way back from the brink of destruction. And he wasn't about to let Cassandra be the one who finally took him down. Daniel Whitmore sat motionless in the back of his car, his fingers gripping the leather seat so tightly that his knuckles ached. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but he barely noticed them. His mind was racing, looping through every moment of the night, every miscalculation, every blind spot he hadn't seen until it was too late. Cassandra had outmaneuvered him, stripped him of his power, and done it all without breaking a sweat. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting to see a message from one of his attorneys or perhaps an emergency alert from his bank. Something, anything, that would tell him he still had time to regain control. But the screen displayed a different name. Jack Sullivan. Daniel hesitated for a split second before answering. Jack had been his closest confidant for years, a man who understood the weight of wealth and power, who had been by Daniel's side through more than one business maneuver that skirted the law. If anyone could help him untangle this mess, it was Jack. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Tell me you have good news." Jack exhaled sharply on the other end. "I don't know what the hell is going on, Daniel, but you need to get ahead of this fast." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" There was a long pause before Jack spoke again, his voice lower, tense. "There's chatter. Your name is circulating in places it shouldn't be. Government agencies. The feds. There are whispers about offshore accounts, corporate fraud, tax evasion. If Cassandra handed over the right paperwork, you might be looking at something a hell of a lot worse than losing your money." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. No, this wasn't happening. She wouldn't. His voice came out colder than he expected, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something dangerously close to doubt. Would she? Jack let out a humorless laugh. "You really want to bet on that? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she's already gutted you financially. If she decides to twist the knife a little deeper, you won't be fighting for your fortune. You'll be fighting to stay out of a prison cell." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. Prison. The word rang in his head like a gunshot. He had built his empire carefully, ensured that every shady deal had a layer of plausible deniability, that every offshore account had enough distance between him and the paper trail. But Cassandra had the details. She had the proof. She had done what no one else had ever managed to do. She had cracked his armor. His fingers dug into his temple as he forced himself to think. What do I do? Jack didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped, urgent. You need to act before she does. Get to your lawyers. Lock down whatever you can before it's too late. Daniel nodded, even though Jack couldn't see him. His mind was already working, calculating the next move. I'll handle it. He ended the call before Jack could respond, staring out the window at the towering skyline that had once felt like it belonged to him. Now, for the first time, it felt fragile. The car slowed as it pulled up to his building, a sleek, modern high-rise that had been a symbol of his power for years. The doorman nodded as Daniel stepped out, but he barely acknowledged him, moving quickly into the elevator, his pulse hammering. The moment the doors slid shut, he exhaled, pressing his palms against the cool metal walls. His own reflection stared back at him, still composed, still sharp, but beneath it, he could see the cracks forming. The elevator ascended swiftly, but the moment the doors slid open to his penthouse, he knew something was wrong. Cassandra was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture relaxed but unshakably firm. She had changed out of her evening gown into something more casual, a silk blouse, tailored pants, but there was nothing casual about the way she was looking at him, like she had already won. Daniel stepped inside, his pulse pounding against his ribs. You've made your point, Cassandra. She tilted her head slightly, sipping her wine. Have I? His fists clenched at his sides. You've taken my accounts, my money. That was enough. Cassandra let out a soft hum, setting her glass down on the marble countertop. Was it? Something about her tone made his blood turn to ice. And then, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, expecting another call from Jack, but what he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. Breaking news. Whitmore Enterprises faces federal investigation for financial misconduct. His entire body locked up. Cassandra reached for her phone, tapping the screen before tossing it onto the couch. It's already everywhere, Daniel. Your name, your accounts, your fraudulent transactions. I told you, you were arrogant. And now, the whole world knows it too. Daniel's vision darkened at the edges. No, he murmured, shaking his head. No, you don't understand what you've done. Cassandra lifted a brow. Oh, I understand perfectly. He moved toward her, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. You think this is just about money? You think you've won because you took what was in my accounts? His voice dropped lower, dangerous. You have no idea what comes next. Cassandra didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out another envelope. Daniel stared at it, his breath ragged. I've already filed for divorce, she said, her voice smooth, unshaken. And before you start threatening me with your usual tactics, let me make something very clear. She stepped forward, pressing the envelope against his chest. Every asset we shared? Already transferred. Every legal loophole you could have used to manipulate the settlement? Already closed. The lawyers have been working on it for months. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. And those private offshore accounts you thought no one could touch? Already seized. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Cassandra leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. You always thought you were playing the long game, Daniel. But you forgot one thing. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. Cassandra smiled, her eyes gleaming with calm, ruthless satisfaction. I was playing it longer. Daniel's breathing was shallow, his world closing in. Cassandra picked up her glass again, turning back toward the city skyline as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just ended him. Daniel staggered back, his mind blank, his body frozen. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just losing. He was already lost. Daniel stood motionless in his penthouse, the walls closing in around him as the weight of Cassandra's words settled like iron in his chest. The news alert on his phone kept flashing, his name now synonymous with financial misconduct, corruption, and scandal. It was everywhere. His empire, the one he had meticulously built over the years, was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His offshore accounts were seized, his company under federal investigation, and Cassandra had orchestrated every single part of it. She had spent months, no, years, planning this downfall. The thought made his stomach turn. Had he really been that blind? Cassandra stood near the window, her expression unreadable, illuminated by the city lights. The same city that had once bowed to his power, now turning against him. She swirled the wine in her glass, taking her time, knowing full well that she had all the power in the room. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push past the shock, past the panic, past the creeping sense of complete and utter failure. He wasn't a man who went down without a fight. He had built himself from the ground up, clawed his way through boardrooms, outmaneuvered more enemies than he could count. He wouldn't let this be the end. His voice was dangerously low when he finally spoke. You did all of this just for revenge? Cassandra turned her head slightly, raising a brow, as if amused by the simplicity of the question. Revenge? She took a sip of her wine, exhaling softly before shaking her head. No, Daniel, this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it, only sharp, bitter disbelief. Justice? You call this justice? He gestured toward the divorce papers she had thrown at him, toward the glowing headlines on his phone, toward everything she had just ripped away from him. Cassandra finally set her glass down, turning to face him fully, and for the first time that night, there was fire behind her gaze. Do you know what the difference between us has always been? She asked, her voice calm but laced with something deeper, something that cut through the air like a knife. Daniel didn't answer, so she stepped closer, closing the space between them. You destroy people because it amuses you. Because power is nothing more than a game to you, she said, her voice sharp. You You manipulate. You push people into corners, and you never once think about the consequences." Daniel scoffed. "Spare me the morality speech, Cassandra. You knew who I was when you married me." Her lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "Yes, I did. But did you ever stop to wonder why I married you?" The question punched through him like a bullet. For the first time, he wasn't sure of the answer. Cassandra exhaled softly, shaking her head. "You thought it was because of your money, because of your charm, because I, like everyone else, was drawn into your world of power and wealth." She gave a small laugh, but there was something haunting in it. "You were so sure of your own importance, so convinced that I was just another pawn in your game, that it never even crossed your mind to question why I stayed." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. She stepped even closer, her voice dropping lower. "I stayed, Daniel, because I was watching." He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. She continued, her voice even, measured. "I watched you build your empire, watched you lie, cheat, and manipulate your way into boardrooms. I watched you steal companies out from under men who trusted you, watched you bury secrets under layers of paperwork so thick that you actually started to believe no one would ever find them." Her gaze darkened. "But most importantly, I watched what you did to my family." Daniel froze. The air shifted, the weight of her words sinking in, inch by inch. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Oh, you don't remember?" His mind raced, searching through years of business deals, corporate takeovers, the bodies left in his wake. Cassandra sighed, shaking her head. "Of course you don't. You've destroyed so many lives that it all blends together, doesn't it?" Then she said a name, and Daniel felt like the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. It hit him. Henry Lancaster. A company acquisition. A hostile takeover that had left an entire family ruined. A man who had spent his life building something of his own, only to have it torn from him by Daniel's greed, by Daniel's ruthlessness, by Daniel's signature on the dotted line. Cassandra saw the recognition in his eyes, and her lips parted into a slow, knowing smile. "Ah, there it is." Daniel took a step back, as if distance would somehow lessen the weight of what he had just realized. Her father. Cassandra was Henry Lancaster's daughter, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted enough to let into his world, had never truly been his. She had been waiting for this. "You married me to destroy me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cassandra's smile didn't fade. "No, Daniel. I married you to undo what you did, to take back what you stole, to make sure you never did it again." His mind reeled. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This wasn't about an affair, or a betrayal, or a simple power play. This had been years in the making. She had been planning his downfall since before they ever said, "I do." Daniel staggered back, gripping the edge of the table as the sheer weight of it all came crashing down on him. Cassandra stepped forward one last time, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I hope you enjoyed your game, Daniel," she murmured. "Because this time, you were the one being played." And with that, she picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and turned away, leaving him to drown in the ruins of his own making. Daniel's mind was a battlefield of fragmented thoughts, his body rigid, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a war drum. The weight of everything Cassandra had revealed pressed against his chest, suffocating, unrelenting. He had spent years convincing himself that he was untouchable, that no one, not his enemies, not his competitors, not even his wife, could ever pull him from the throne he had built with his own hands. And yet, here he was, standing in the ruins of his empire while she toasted to his downfall. Cassandra still held her wine glass, the deep red liquid swirling gently as she watched him. The look in her eyes wasn't cruel, wasn't vengeful. It was calm, composed, the gaze of someone who had already moved past the wreckage while he was still struggling to understand that the collapse had even happened. "To new beginnings," she murmured, the words hanging in the air between them, a soft, final dagger. Daniel's throat was dry, his muscles locked in place as if his body refused to accept the truth. He wanted to fight, to scream, to tear through the walls and prove that he could still fix this, that he could still come out on top. But he had no moves left. She had seen to that. Cassandra took a sip of her wine, her movements slow, deliberate. The air between them was thick, charged with everything that had been left unsaid. The woman he had married, the woman he had believed was nothing more than a fixture in his life, a passive participant in his world of power and control, had unraveled him from the inside out. He had never seen it coming. His fingers twitched at his sides. He forced himself to take a slow breath, to regain even the smallest ounce of control, but his mind refused to quiet. The evidence had been too thorough, too damning, too precise. The offshore accounts gone. The company, under investigation. The legal teams that had once answered to him without question were now untangling the very knots he had tied. And Cassandra, the woman he had so foolishly underestimated, had orchestrated it all. The thought was unbearable. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "You really think this is over?" Cassandra arched a brow, setting her glass down gently on the counter before turning to face him fully. "It is over, Daniel." His pulse spiked, anger threading through his veins, desperate for a foothold. "You think you can just walk away from this? That I'll just sit back and watch while you destroy everything I built?" His voice was low, dangerous, but even as the words left his lips, he knew they were empty threats. Cassandra didn't flinch. She had expected this. "Destroy," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "I didn't destroy anything, Daniel. You did that yourself. I just made sure the world saw it." Daniel's fingers curled into fists. His empire had been built on calculated moves, on strategy, on ensuring that every risk was measured, every outcome controlled. But Cassandra had never been a factor in his calculations. He had never believed she could outmaneuver him, let alone decimate him. And now, he was the one searching for an escape. A sharp breath left his chest. His gaze flicked toward the documents on the coffee table, the evidence of his downfall, the proof that his power had been stripped from him, piece by piece. His lawyers wouldn't be able to fix this. His money couldn't buy his way out. The government was already circling like vultures, and the one person who might have once stood beside him had ensured he had nowhere to run. She had played the long game, and he had never stood a chance. Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Cassandra waited, her expression unreadable. Daniel forced himself to smirk, a desperate attempt at salvaging some illusion of control. "You think you're different from me?" he asked, his voice smooth despite the storm raging inside him. "You think you did all of this for some noble cause? You're just as ruthless as I am." Something flickered in Cassandra's gaze. Not anger, not indignation, but something colder. "I never claimed to be noble, Daniel," she said simply. His smirk faltered. "I did what needed to be done," she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "And the difference between us? I'm not the one drowning." Daniel's chest tightened, the truth in her words landing like a direct hit. Cassandra exhaled softly, picking up her wine glass once more, her fingers wrapping around the delicate stem. "You built this empire thinking you were invincible, that no one could touch you, that you could take and never have to answer for it. But power doesn't work like that, Daniel." She swirled the wine again, watching the liquid move before glancing back at him. "It never lasts forever." Daniel's hands shook. His entire body felt taut, like a wire pulled too tight, like a machine on the verge of snapping apart. His mind raced, desperate for something to latch onto, for any piece of leverage left. But there was nothing. Cassandra lifted her glass, her lips parting in another slow, knowing smile. "So, here's to your legacy," she murmured. "May it rest in peace." Daniel's vision blurred at the edges, rage, humiliation, and something far more dangerous burning through him like wildfire. Cassandra took one final sip, savoring it, before setting the empty glass down with a soft clink against the marble countertop. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall, leaving him standing there, alone, with the wreckage of his life surrounding him. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's breath was shallow, his mind spinning as the weight of everything finally crashed down on him in full. For the first time in his life, he had lost. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could ever come back from it. Daniel sat in the dimly lit penthouse, his fingers pressing against his temples, the weight of his downfall pressing harder with each second. The silence was thick, suffocating, wrapping around him like an iron cage. His empire was gone, his power stripped away, his money seized before he even had the chance to fight for it. The world outside still moved, the city lights blinking in the distance, the hum of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. His phone vibrated against the table, breaking the stillness. He ignored it at first, but it continued, insistent. Another headline? Another betrayal? Another nail in the coffin of his legacy? With a sharp inhale, he reached for it, his pulse tightening in anticipation. Jack Sullivan's name flashed on the screen. He hesitated before answering, his voice raw when he finally spoke. "Tell me something I want to hear, Jack." A long sigh came from the other end of the line. "I've got nothing, Daniel. It's bad. Really bad." Daniel closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "How bad?" Jack's voice dropped lower, cautious. "The feds are deep into the investigation now. The accounts are locked, the SEC is involved, and your company's stock is in freefall. Investors are pulling out fast. Whatever Cassandra gave them, it was enough to make them move quickly." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "There has to be a way to stop this." "There isn't," Jack said bluntly, "and you know it." A sharp exhale left Daniel's chest, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. He had always been able to find a way out, always. No matter the scandal, no matter the legal gray areas he had operated in, he had always landed on his feet. But this was different. This wasn't just a bad deal or a financial setback. This was destruction. His company was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. His name, once synonymous with wealth and control, was now being dragged through the mud in breaking news reports and financial analysis pieces, dissecting his downfall like vultures circling a dying animal. "How much time do I have before they officially come for me?" he asked, his voice colder now, detached. Jack hesitated. "Days, at best. Maybe less." Daniel exhaled slowly. It was over. He had known it since the moment Cassandra slid those documents across the table, but hearing it from Jack, hearing it confirmed in the voice of a man who had seen powerful men fall before, made it more real than ever. "She really took everything," he muttered, almost to himself. Jack hesitated. "Yeah, she did." Daniel let his head fall back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The weight in his chest wasn't just rage anymore. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Regret? Helplessness? Loss? Whatever it was, he hated it. "Do I have anything left?" he finally asked. Jack was quiet for a long moment before sighing. "A couple of assets they haven't touched yet, but they will. The houses, the cars, the overseas holdings. It's all either frozen or flagged. And after today's headlines, no one's going to touch you, Daniel. Your name is toxic now." Daniel clenched his jaw. "So, that's it? I'm just supposed to sit here and let everything I built get torn apart?" Jack's voice hardened. "You don't have a choice. Cassandra made sure of that." Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of her name. His wife. His destroyer. Jack exhaled. "I'll keep digging, but you need to prepare for the worst. I'll call you if I find anything." The call ended with a dull beep, leaving Daniel in deafening silence once again. His phone screen dimmed, the notifications waiting. News articles, emails from panicked investors, desperate messages from people who once praised his name but were now scrambling to distance themselves. He tossed the phone onto the table, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his hands pressing against his face. Cassandra had taken everything, and yet she had left him standing. That was the part that burned the most. She hadn't just ruined him. She had made sure he was still here to watch it happen in real time. A slow breath escaped him, his mind swirling. What now? His instinct screamed at him to fight, to retaliate, to find a way to crawl out of this wreckage and claw his way back up. But how? With what? Every resource had been severed before he even knew he was bleeding. His gaze lifted, scanning the penthouse. It was empty now. The weight of it felt different. This place had once been a symbol of his power, his influence. Now it was nothing more than a cage. He thought back to the look in Cassandra's eyes before she walked away. There had been no hatred, no rage, just certainty. The kind of certainty that only came from knowing the battle had already been won. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself up from the couch. He moved to the bar, pouring himself a drink with steady hands. But inside, he was unraveling. The glass was cool against his fingertips, the amber liquid swirling as he brought it to his lips. The first sip burned. The second didn't. His reflection stared back at him from the glass walls, but he barely recognized the man looking back. He wasn't Daniel Whitmore, the untouchable mogul, anymore. He was just another fallen king. The realization settled in his bones, cold and sharp. For years, he had played the game, believing he was the master of it, believing no one could outmaneuver him. And yet, the woman he had slept beside for years had been the one to bring him down. A bitter chuckle left his throat. Cassandra had been right about one thing. Power never lasts forever. Daniel sat in the dim glow of the penthouse, the city stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline, once a source of pride, now felt distant, foreign, like a world he no longer belonged to. His empire had crumbled, his name was in ruins, and the silence that filled the room was deafening. The weight of what had happened settled over him in layers, suffocating, inescapable. His phone sat on the table beside him, face down, buzzing occasionally with notifications he no longer cared to read. He already knew what they said. More losses, more betrayals, more evidence that the world had moved on without him. He had built an empire that made him untouchable, or so he thought. He had manipulated, deceived, and outmaneuvered everyone in his path, believing himself invincible. But he wasn't invincible, and Cassandra had proved it. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, fingers threading through his hair as he exhaled sharply. He had spent the last few days watching everything slip through his fingers, powerless to stop it. His lawyers had tried to delay the inevitable, but the evidence was too damning. The offshore accounts were gone, the board had turned against him, and the authorities were closing in. His reputation was in shambles. Once, people had sought his favor, clung to his every word, maneuvered to stay on his good side. Now, they were distancing themselves, scrubbing his name from their records, pretending they had never known him. Investors were withdrawing their support, associates were severing ties, and even those who had once praised him were now using his downfall as a cautionary tale. He had become a lesson. Daniel reached for the half-empty glass of scotch beside him, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. The burn was familiar, but it didn't bring him any comfort. Nothing did. He stared at the reflection of the city in the glass, the towering buildings illuminated against the night sky. For years, he had looked down at this city and seen it as something he controlled. But now, he was just another man looking up at a world that no longer cared who he was. A sharp buzz pulled him from his thoughts. His gaze flicked to the phone. Cassandra. He hadn't heard from her since that night, since she walked away without a single glance back, leaving him in the wreckage of his own making. His fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to answer. Then, the message came. Check the news. His stomach tightened. His fingers moved before he could stop himself, unlocking the phone, opening the news app. The top headline hit him like a fist to the gut. Cassandra Lancaster acquires Whitmore Holdings in unprecedented takeover. For a moment, he just stared, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. She hadn't just destroyed him. She had taken everything. His mind raced as he scanned the article, his heart pounding in his chest. The takeover had been swift, the legal transition seamless. Too seamless. Which meant she had planned this from the beginning. His company, the one he had built from nothing, the one he had fought for, sacrificed for. It was hers now. The realization settled deep in his bones. This wasn't revenge. This was erasure. He had assumed that once she destroyed him, she would disappear, satisfied with leaving him in ruins. But he had underestimated her again. She hadn't just wanted to take away his wealth. She had wanted to take his legacy. And she had. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening around the phone. He could almost hear her voice, calm and measured. the same way she had spoken to him that night when she slid the evidence across the table and shattered his world. "You always thought you were playing the long game, Daniel. But you forgot one thing. I was playing it longer." He squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling through his nose. He had spent his entire life making sure he was the one on top, that no one ever got close enough to hurt him, to betray him, to leave him vulnerable. And yet, the woman who had shared his bed, the woman he had believed was nothing more than an accessory to his life, had taken everything he had spent years building. His chest tightened. The headlines scrolled across the screen, each one another nail in the coffin of what he used to be. Cassandra Lancaster reshapes the industry following Whitmore collapse. From scorned wife to business mogul, how Cassandra Lancaster outplayed a titan. The woman who took down Daniel Whitmore. The last one stung the most. Because it was true. He set the phone down slowly, staring at the empty glass in front of him. She hadn't ruined him out of spite. She had done it because she could. And the world loved her for it. Daniel let out a bitter, humorless laugh, the sound barely more than a breath. For years, he had believed that power was about control, about making sure no one could ever dictate his fate. But Cassandra had taken that power and used it against him. She had spent years waiting, watching, learning his every move. She had played him, and she had won. The scotch burned down his throat as he swallowed the last of it, but it did nothing to dull the sharp, gnawing realization in his chest. This wasn't just the end of his empire. It was the end of him. Daniel Whitmore was no longer a man who commanded fear. He was no longer the king of his world. He was a footnote in Cassandra's success story, and that was the cruelest punishment of all.